The Joseon dynasty was an era governed by the rigid whispers of ink and brush. Yet, beneath the surface of its scholarly order, there lingered shadows of ancient, forbidden magic. In a secluded temple, nestled deep within the mist-shrouded valleys of Songdo, a young man named Jeon Woo-chi spent his days immersed in the classics. He was a scholar of exceptional intellect, but his gaze often wandered beyond the parchment, toward the secrets of the natural world. The quietude of his studies was interrupted by a mysterious woman who began visiting him each night. She was ethereal, possessed of a beauty that seemed to defy the earthly realm. Her visits were silent and hypnotic, and with every encounter, a strange lethargy began to seep into Woo-chi's soul. He was wasting away, his vitality drained by a presence he could not name. One evening, as the moon hung like a silver sickle in the sky, a passing monk observed the young scholar's gaunt face and warned him. The woman was no mortal. She was a gumiho, a 1,000-year-old fox in human form, seeking to ascend by stealing the essence of men. To survive, Woo-chi would have to seize the source of her power, the fox's marble, known as the Yuiju. When the woman arrived that night, the air grew heavy with the scent of wild lilies and damp earth. As they embraced, the fox released the luminous marble into Woo-chi's mouth, a ritual to refine the energy she had harvested. In that moment of visceral tension, Woo-chi did not return it. Instead, he gathered his remaining strength and swallowed the cooling, pulsating orb. A violent struggle ensued as the creature's facade shattered. The temple walls trembled with the fox's primal rage, but the marble's power had already begun to merge with his spirit. As the fox fled into the dark woods, defeated and diminished, Woo-chi collapsed. When he finally looked up at the sky, the world had changed. He no longer saw just stars and clouds. He saw the celestial gears of the universe turning. He could read the language of the wind and the intentions of the earth. The marble had granted him the Chunmun, the ability to understand the laws of heaven. Shortly after his awakening, Woo-chi discovered a hidden compartment within the temple's ancient pillars. Inside lay a weathered scroll, bound in silk that felt like woven moonlight. This was the Chunseo, the heavenly book of arcane arts. It contained the blueprints for distorting reality, how to call upon the storms, how to walk through solid walls, and how to manipulate the very fabric of time. Jeon Woo-chi was no longer a mere scholar bound by the laws of men. He had become a master of the unseen, a Taoist of formidable power. But in a world plagued by corruption and hunger, such power was a heavy burden. Thus began the journey of the most mercurial rebel Joseon had ever known. As Jeon Woo-chi's power grew, so too did his awareness of the rot festering at the heart of Joseon. It was a time of bitter irony. While the granaries of the nobility overflowed with tax-heavy grain, the peasant villages echoed with the hollow cries of the starving. The laws of men, which Woo-chi had once studied so diligently, now seemed like nothing more than shackles designed to protect the predators from their prey. He decided that if the heavens remained silent, he would speak in their stead. But he would not do so through humble petitions. He would do it through grand, theatrical deception. In the royal capital, a strange phenomenon began to unfold. One morning, the sky above the palace didn't just brighten with the sun, it glowed with an otherworldly golden radiance. High above the throne room, amid swirling clouds of incense-scented mist, a figure appeared. Draped in robes of celestial white and standing upon a bridge of shimmering light, the figure announced himself as a messenger from the Jade Emperor of the heavens. The king and his ministers, paralyzed by a mixture of awe and primal fear, prostrated themselves upon the cold stone floor. The celestial official, who was, of course, Jeon Woo-chi in a masterfully crafted illusion, spoke with a voice that vibrated through their very bones. He claimed that the Jade Emperor was constructing a new palace in the heavens and required a singular contribution from the earthly realm, a massive beam of pure, solid gold. To refuse was to invite divine wrath. Driven by superstition and the desperate need to maintain their perceived legitimacy, the court scrambled. They melted down treasures, taxed the provinces further, and exhausted the royal treasury until a magnificent, heavy beam of gold was forged. With a flick of his wrist and a silent incantation from the Chunseo Woo-chi, caused the golden beam to rise into the air. To the eyes of the terrified court, it vanished into the clouds, seemingly accepted by the gods. In reality, it had merely been transported to a secret storehouse on the outskirts of the city. Within days, the gold was gone, not to the heavens, but to the markets. Woo-chi sold the beam piece by piece, converting the hoarded wealth of the corrupt into mountains of rice and grain. Hidden by his charms, he traveled from one famine-stricken village to another, leaving bags of food and silver at the doorsteps of those who had lost all hope. Word spread like wildfire. The people whispered of a cloud-riding Taoist who stole from the heavens to feed the earth. But in the palace, the atmosphere turned from reverence to a cold, simmering fury. The king realized he had been duped by a mortal using forbidden arts. The search for Jeon Woo-chi was no longer a matter of law, it was a vendetta. The rogue Taoist had not just stolen gold, he had stolen the dignity of the crown, and for that, there would be no mercy. The search for Jeon Woo-chi became an obsession that gripped the royal court like a slow-burning fever. To the king, Woo-chi was no longer a mere thief. He was a tear in the fabric of social order, a living mockery of the crown's absolute power. The state's machinery turned with cold, relentless precision. Every mountain pass was guarded, and every shadow in the capital was scrutinized by the eyes of the royal investigators. Yet Woo-chi moved through this net of steel like a breeze through a forest. He walked through crowded marketplaces wearing the weathered face of a toothless beggar, or sat in the very taverns where soldiers boasted of his impending capture, quietly sipping wine while listening to his own legend grow. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost haunting the very men who hunted him. Eventually, the inevitable occurred, or perhaps it was simply the day Woo-chi grew weary of the game. In a narrow, rain-slicked alleyway in the heart of Songdo, he allowed himself to be cornered. Surrounded by a phalanx of spears and the heavy breathing of exhausted men, he did not resist. He stood still, a faint, inscrutable smile playing on his lips as they bound him in iron chains, so heavy they would have crushed a lesser man's spirit. He was dragged before the high court, not for a trial, but for a spectacle of retribution. The ministers, safely ensconced behind their ranks of guards, spat accusations of heresy and rebellion. They sentenced him to a death that was meant to be as slow as it was public. But as the sentence was read, Woo-chi remained untouched by fear. His eyes, clear and unnervingly calm, seemed to look through the stone walls of the palace toward a horizon only he could see, as a final, mocking indulgence. The king granted Woo-chi one last request before his execution. Woo-chi did not ask for a final meal or a message to his kin. Instead, he asked for a cup of wine and a painter's brush. Thinking it a harmless whim of a broken man, they provided them. Woo-chi did not drink the wine. Instead, with a sudden, fluid motion, he splashed the liquid against the cold gray wall of his cell. Then, with the grace of a master calligrapher, he began to stroke the damp surface with his brush. Before the eyes of the stunned guards and ministers, a landscape began to breathe. From the blank stone, a vast, misty mountain range emerged, rendered in exquisite ink-washed detail. At the base of a jagged peak, a small, sturdy donkey waited by the edge of a crystalline brook. The scent of pine needles and wet earth began to fill the stale air of the dungeon, an olfactory, impossible reality. Without a word, Woo-chi stepped out of his heavy iron shackles, as if they were made of nothing more than dried straw. He turned to the king, gave a slow, mocking bow of farewell, and stepped into the wall. The witnesses watched in paralyzed silence as Woo-chi mounted the painted donkey. He rode deeper into the landscape he had just created, his figure growing smaller and smaller against the painted horizon. He crossed a bridge, ascended a misty path, and finally vanished into the white void of the brushstrokes. When the guards rushed to the wall, they found only cold, dry stone and a painting of a man who was no longer there. Jeon Woo-chi had not escaped his prison. He had simply rewritten the rules of the world. Having dissolved to the ink and mist of his own creation, Jeon Woo-chi wandered the southern provinces, a ghost in the world of men. He no longer sought to provoke the throne. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the quiet tragedies that unfolded in the corners of the kingdom, the ones the history books would never record. In a village where the mountains cast long, mournful shadows, Woo-chi encountered a widow whose eyes were clouded by a grief that transcended the loss of her husband. She was a woman trapped by the cruelty of local custom and the greed of her kin. Her in-laws, seeking to seize her modest inheritance, had accused her of infidelity, a charge that carried the weight of social death in Joseon. They intended to drive her into the mountains to perish, all under the guise of protecting the family's honor. Woo-chi watched from the rafters of their ancestral hall, his heart stirring with a cold, righteous anger. He did not descend with a sword or a thunderclap. Instead, he manipulated the very environment around the corrupt relatives. During their nightly feast, the wind began to howl in the cadence of the deceased husband's voice. The shadows of the trees elongated into grasping hands, and the family's stolen wealth turned to ash and dry leaves before their eyes. Terrified by what they perceived as a divine haunting, they confessed their sins to the village elders, and the widow's name was restored. Woo-chi left as silently as he had arrived, leaving only a single, blooming wildflower on her doorstep, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. But Woo-chi's journey was not only defined by the strangers he saved, it was tested by the friends he kept. He traveled many miles to visit an old companion, a brilliant but impoverished scholar who had once shared his dreams of a just world. He found the man in a state of ruin, framed for a crime he did not commit by a rival who coveted his scholarly position. The friend was destined for exile, his spirit broken and his future erased. The Taoist knew that to save his friend, he had to play a dangerous game with the local magistrate. Using his arts, Woo-chi created a series of bewildering omens that suggested the magistrate's own corruption was being monitored by the spirits of his ancestors. He replaced the magistrate's official seal with a heavy, unliftable stone and made the very walls of the government office bleed ink. Driven to the brink of madness by these supernatural warnings, the magistrate cleared the scholar's name in a desperate attempt to appease the spirits. When the friend was finally freed, he found a modest pouch of gold and a letter waiting for him. The letter bore no signature, only a familiar, elegant script that spoke of the enduring strength of the bamboo in winter. Through these acts, Jeon Woo-chi became more than a legend of magic. He became a symbol of hidden justice. Yet, even as he mended the lives of others, a sense of profound isolation began to settle over him. He was a man who lived between worlds, too powerful for the company of men, yet too human to fully join the gods. The cost of his freedom was the very connection he sought to protect, a bittersweet truth that echoed in his footsteps as he walked toward the north, where a greater challenge awaited. For years, Jeon Woo-chi had reigned over the unseen world. He had tricked kings, humbled the powerful, and rewritten the boundaries of reality with a stroke of a brush. Hubris, like a slow creeping ivy, had begun to entwine itself around his spirit. He believed he had reached the summit of all arcane knowledge, viewing the world as a mere stage for his cleverness. But the heavens had a way of correcting those who mistook their reflection in a puddle for the depth of the ocean. Word reached Woo-chi of a man named Seo Gyeongdeok, a scholar of immense wisdom and quiet power who lived in the shadow of Mount Hwadam. It was said that Gyeongdeok did not use talismans or incantations. He simply understood the fundamental rhythm of the universe. To Woo-chi, this was a challenge he could not ignore. He sought to prove that his vibrant, chaotic magic was superior to the cold, scholarly austerity of the man they called Hwadam. Woo-chi arrived at Hwadam's humble dwelling with the intention of making a grand display. He summoned illusions of terrifying beasts and conjured storms that shook the very foundations of the mountain. He multiplied himself into 100 warriors, each brandishing a sword of spectral light. He expected the scholar to tremble, to beg for mercy, or at the very least, to be impressed. Yet, Seo Gyeongdeok remained seated on his wooden porch, his gaze fixed on a simple book of philosophy. He did not look up when the lightning struck, nor did he flinch when the illusory tigers roared in his face. To Hwadam, these were not threats, they were mere ripples on the surface of a deep lake. With a calm, measured voice that seemed to resonate from the earth itself, the master spoke. He did not criticize Woo-chi's power. He criticized its purpose. He spoke of the difference between tricks that bend the eye and the truth that aligns the heart with the great void. Sensing his illusions were failing, Woo-chi attempted to strike at the master's mind directly. But as he reached out with his spiritual energy, he felt as if he were trying to grasp the mist. Hwadam was not fighting back. He was simply there, as immovable as the mountain and as fluid as the stream. In a sudden, jarring moment of clarity, Woo-chi realized that his magic was a parasite on reality, while a Hwadam was a part of reality itself. The master gently waved a hand, and the storms ceased. the beasts vanished. The silence that followed was heavier than any thunder Woo-chi had ever summoned. Hwadam looked at the young Taoist, not with anger, but with a profound, aching compassion. He explained that power without virtue is a prison, and that true mastery lies not in changing the world, but in changing oneself to serve the natural order. For the first time since he had swallowed the fox's marble, Jeon Woo-chi felt small. The ego he had nurtured so carefully shattered like glass. He knelt before the scholar, the weight of his iron chains replaced by the far heavier weight of genuine humility. He begged the master to teach him, not more tricks, but the path to becoming a true human being. Hwadam accepted, and thus the rogue who had once toyed with the world began his most difficult journey, the long, silent walk into the heart of his own ignorance. Time, in the shadow of Mount Hwadam, flowed differently. Under the silent tutelage of Seo Gyeongdok, Jeon Woo-chi began to peel away the layers of his own vanity. The man who once sought to dazzle the world with thunder was learning the far greater power of silence. He realized that the greatest magic was not the distortion of reality, but the mastery of the mind that perceived it. Yet, the world of men was not so easily escaped. In the capital, the king's grudge had only hardened with age. To the crown, a man who could walk through walls and feed the poor with stolen royal gold was a wound that would not heal. The royal machinations continued, darker and more desperate. They seized Woo-chi's distant kin and threatened the innocent, using the very compassion he had once shown as a weapon against him. The message was clear. There was no room in Joseon for a power that did not bow to the throne. Woo-chi saw the smoke of this approaching storm from the mountain peaks. He knew that to truly find peace, he had to settle his accounts with the mundane world one last time, not with the fire of a rebel, but with the cold clarity of a sage. He returned to the city, walking through the gates not as a god, but as a shadow. He visited the halls of power, leaving no footprints but sowing seeds of profound unease. To the corrupt officials, he granted visions of their own mortality, showing them the skeletal remains of the wealth they so greedily hoarded. He did not harm them. He simply held up a mirror to the transience of their authority. The terror he inspired was no longer the fear of a thief, but the existential dread of men realizing they were nothing more than dust. The final confrontation was a masterpiece of orchestrated fate. Woo-chi allowed the royal guards to find him in a secluded grove. He stood motionless as they surrounded him, his expression one of weary, ancient patience. They struck him down, or so they believed. They saw his body fall, they felt the cold steel bite into his flesh, and they reported his death to a jubilant king. But as the funeral rites were performed and the official records were sealed, a strange rumor began to drift through the provinces. When the royal investigators opened his casket to confirm his identity, they found no corpse. Inside lay only a hollow shell of dried cicada skin and a single withered peach blossom. Jeon Woo-chi had performed the Jumsan Tal Gak, the shedding of the golden cicada's shell. He had used his death to kill his own legend, severing the last threads that bound him to the kingdom of men. As the king's men stared at the empty grave, realizing they had been fighting a ghost all along, Woo-chi was already miles away. He was walking back toward the high, cold ridges of the north, leaving behind the noise of history for the eternal silence of the Tao. The rogue was dead. The immortal was born. The world of Joseon continued its restless dance of power and poverty. But for Jeon Woo-chi, the music had finally faded into a distant hum. He traveled north, not with the haste of a fugitive, but with the steady, rhythmic pace of the seasons. His destination was the Taebaek Mountains, the ancestral spine of the land, where the granite peaks pierced the clouds and the air was thin enough to taste the breath of the heavens. There, amidst the ancient pines that had witnessed the birth of kingdoms, he found Seo Gyeongdeok. The master was waiting, as if he had never moved from his spot on the jagged ridge. No words were exchanged. Between two who understand the Tao, speech is often a clumsy substitute for silence. They stood together, looking down at the world they were leaving behind. A patchwork of golden fields, winding rivers, and the smoke of 1,000 chimneys, all shrouded in the violet haze of dusk. Woo-chi realized then that his journey had never been about the gold he stole or the kings he mocked. Those were merely the symptoms of a soul trying to find its place in an imperfect world. Under Hoadam's guidance, he had learned that the ultimate rebellion was not changing the law, but transcending the need for it. He took the Chun Seo, the heavenly book that had been both his greatest weapon and his heaviest burden, and offered it to the wind. The pages scattered like white birds, their ink dissolving into the mountain mist. The secrets of the gods were returned to the source, no longer needed by a man who had become the secret himself. Legend says that on that evening, a brilliant light enveloped the summit of Taebaek, a glow so intense it was mistaken for a second moon by the villagers below. When the light faded, the ridge was empty. No footprints remained in the snow, and no voices echoed in the canyons. Jeon Woo-chi and Seo Gyeongdeok had not merely climbed a mountain, they had stepped off the map of history and into the realm of the eternal. Yet, even in the centuries that followed, the name of Jeon Woo-chi never truly vanished. He became a whisper in the ears of the oppressed, a sudden breeze in a windowless cell, and the inexplicable shadow seen on the moonlit walls of corrupt palaces. People said he lived on as a protector of the spirit, a reminder that as long as there is injustice, there will be those who dream of the impossible. The rogue Taoist had achieved the rarest of fates. He did not die, nor did he simply vanish. He became the wind, the mist, and the enduring hope of a people. His story ended not with a period, but with an ellipsis, echoing forever through the valleys of the morning calm. The man of tricks had become the master of truth, and at the highest peak of Joseon, he finally found the only thing his magic could never conjure: peace.